us would probably, okay, many, or if not most of us, would probably say, don't imitate me, imitate somebody else, because we're so aware of our own faults. But maybe that is a reminder to us that we need to look at our lives and understand that there are people looking at us. It may not be apparent from day to day, but there are people that are looking at the way we handle ourselves and the way that we handle difficulties. And we need to be able to say, imitate me. It may be people, we think of people that we meet in work or in school, but it may be people in your own home that you're setting a continuous example for them. Again, I always, we have a hymn in our book by a missionary by the name of Stephen Bilak. He's from Ukraine, which is in the news now, but he was a missionary there because he's Ukrainian himself. And he spoke at Northwest once when I was just a young fellow, so that tells you it was a long time ago. And he said, "That's my name, and that's the way I live. Bilak, be like me." He said, "I want to live so that I can go back to my country and say to them, be like me." And so that's just because of that unusual name and the circumstance, it stuck with me over all the years. Be like me. Can we really say that? If not, maybe we need to make some changes. Anyway, I'm sending to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. So that's pretty important, isn't it? That the way of life agrees with what we teach. Is that always the case? Some people preach, don't pay attention to worldly things, but then we take a look at their lives and seem like they pay a lot of attention to worldly things. What was Paul's manner of life or way of life?
Seemed like he would travel around to different places where, there might already be an established church there, or it might be a place where it would be, where he had never been before, where no one had ever brought the gospel.
Yeah.
And then he would, I think his usual practice in places where there was no church, he would go to the synagogue first, and he would preach there, and then perhaps find a few who would believe, but and then he would go out into the community and preach. But when he would go to, especially where there was no church there, or there was already a church, he wouldn't expect them necessarily to support him. He would work at his profession, which was tent making.
So, he was one who put the preaching first. We get a little glimpse of an aspect of Paul's manner of life in the previous paragraphs, because he says, verse 11, "To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. Up to this moment, we have become the scum of the earth, the refuse of the world." So he's kind of saying Timothy can tell you that that's my manner of life.
Yeah.
Not a very attractive one.
Alan, I think we could call that a cross-shaped life. That's what I called it last week.
Yeah.
That's what he lived. And I don't think we're all called, and we were called to live a cross-shaped life too, but maybe not to an extreme that he did. You know, we're not gonna live, you know, like he did, but we're called to that type of thing. You know?
Yeah. If someone were to be called upon to remind people of my way of life or your way of life, you know, what would it be? What would they say? Like you say, Dan, they probably couldn't say all of those things about us and the way that Paul suffered.
No.
Maybe they'd say, well, he lived a pretty comfortable life, and every so often, came to church, or, just how will you be remembered? What will people think about you as someone who talked about Jesus, or as someone who, kind of fit in the way of the world? So anyway, here Paul is kind of reiterating his authority by saying, Timothy can tell you that I gave up a lot for the gospel, and that's a kind of a proof of the validity of the gospel, that the people who spread it were willing to sacrifice so much. If they didn't really believe it, they wouldn't live that way. They wouldn't endure so much.
Well,
Jesus.
I think the centuries, have gone by, have kind of softened us up a little bit. The gospel has become kind of old hat, you might say.
Well,
it's out there. I can read articles in the Tribune about the gospel, and what churches are doing in our metropolitan area. It's spelled out in there periodically. They have a religious editor, for example. So people are more familiar with, the gospel and the church and the Bible than they were back in Paul's day. In Paul's day, it was fresh, new. It wasn't old hat. So it was. There's a cultural difference there. I'm just saying, that, and thankfully we don't have to go to the same extremes that he did, and it probably wouldn't do any good if we did.
That's kind of the purposes of our meeting, isn't it? To keep the gospel new to us, to constantly be considering aspects of it, to constantly be reminded of Jesus' sacrifice. That in a sense, that's what the tools we use are for, the purpose of keeping the gospel new to us. Think so? At least that's one way to view it. Anyway, our life should agree with our teaching. Some of you have become arrogant as if I were not coming to you, but I will come to you very soon if the Lord is willing. And then I will find out not only how these arrogant people are talking, but what power they have. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. What do you prefer? Shall I come to you with a whip, or in love and with a gentle spirit? So he's coming, and the letter is kind of a preparation. Any other comments or thoughts on? We kind of change a topic here as we go into the 5th chapter. He's been really, all of those first 4 chapters that we have are on the subject of division and unity. So that's the first outline topic of this book. Be unified. Well, then he jumps in chapter 5. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that does not occur even among pagans. A man has his father's wife. So that's a problem. What's the problem there?
Well, that was something that was forbidden in the law. of Moses. But
Yes.
then he goes on and he says that, you're proud, you're tolerating this behavior. And then he
Yeah.
says, not even the pagans allow something like that.
Yeah. I was going to talk about this situation as, well, the church has, under God, we have different standards from the world, what the world accepts, what the world tolerates. But here he says this is something that even the world doesn't tolerate and views as bad. A man has his father's wife, maybe not the mother, maybe the stepmother there, but still, it's not something that's pleasing to God. But it's something evidently that within the church it was accepted and they were proud. What would they be proud of?
Well, it may be not that they're proud of that per se, though they haven't done anything to address it, which is kind of an issue in churches even today, where there's stuff that goes on in churches and you wind up hearing about it in the news instead of the church, doing something about it proactively. You hear about it when somebody's caught, but maybe it's not that they're proud of that exactly, but perhaps it goes back to the arrogance that he was talking about in the previous chapter. You're acting arrogantly, like you've got it all figured out. And look, this is going on right under your noses, and you're not even batting an eye about it. You're not even confronting this among yourselves. It's something that ought to be I think he's kind of getting at, it ought to be a no-brainer. This is something that's not hard. This is not this is not a gray area. And their arrogance about their own, knowledge and wisdom and has blinded them to it.
I get the impression too that it may have been something that we see in our own time. The church, well, we're up to date. We're not judgmental. We're tolerant of everything and everybody. And that's a temptation also for the church to kind of fit in with whatever society is willing to accept. That, the church has to modify its outlook and its teachings to accept just about anything and everything. And he's going to have a list later in this chapter of some things that the church has to be careful about tolerating. It's easy to point to, or it's easier perhaps to point to sexual immorality and that type of thing, but there's some other attitudes that are bad also. What's another problem here that we get to in verse 5? Let's see. Shouldn't you rather have been filled with grief and have put out of your fellowship the man who did this? Even though I am not physically present, I am with you in spirit, and I have already passed judgment on the one who did this, just as if I were present. Is that judging? Is that good or bad? Paul's passing judgment.
Bad. It's bad.
Well, we judge that sin is bad, and if we see sin, what do we need to do?
We need to recognize it and condemn it or make sure people realize what it is. And like later in the chapter, he says they should expel this person, and then and not in a I don't know, we condemn you to hell. Perhaps to wake him up
Yeah.
and make him recognize the nature of what he's doing and perhaps save him.
Yeah.
Because if he continues in this, this egregious sin, he will be lost.
Yeah, that's another problem here, isn't it? There's several problems here. But that is the one that he mentions in verse 5. Hand this man over to Satan so that the sinful nature may be destroyed and his spirit saved on the day of the Lord. Maybe a kind of a shock of what they would say and do would lead him to rethink this, and so that he would change. And that's kind of typical of what Jesus, when he was teaching, he was concerned about what was going on, but he was concerned about the spirit and the spirit eternally. So that's, it's easy to say, well, we got to protect the church, but what's best for this individual? What's most likely to lead them to repentance and service to God? And not saying anything is not the answer. So that's another problem that is part of the life of the church. Confrontation, confronting. That's hard, isn't it?
Nobody likes confrontation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Nobody
it
likes
sounds like Paul's
confrontation.
recommending like an intervention. I think we all know what an intervention is, right?
Yeah.
3 or 4 people come together and they confront that brother or sister with the problem, and they make a serious deal out of it, and that's appropriate, I think, under certain circumstances. We rarely do it, but it would be appropriate.
That's it. But confrontation, whether it's in the church or whether it's in the home or whether it's in the workplace, is hard. People would rather do almost anything than confront someone. It's easier in the home to just let our children, it's not the easiest thing to confront children, especially as they get a little older. In the workplace, confrontation is hard. The annual review is difficult for both sides. Because it involves a little bit of a confrontation. How are you doing? Are you doing a good job? Most bosses will do anything to avoid that. I had a boss who for years, he put my annual review on my chair when I was out to lunch. He didn't want to confront me about it. It wasn't that bad, but still in all, it was hard. And, sometimes we as employees sit back and say, this guy, we have a difficult situation with the boss. But on the other hand, they're viewing it as a very difficult situation too. But anyway, and especially in our Christian relationships, it's hard to say to someone, have you thought about that maybe you need to change your life? Have you thought about, no, maybe this is not the best way to live? And it's hard because most of us can say, well, I got the same faults. Dan, you talked about the church. I've been at Northwest Church of Christ for 72 years. I don't remember us ever disfellowshipping anybody or expelling anybody, have we?
And not out in the open. I know my father was confronted with an adulterous situation.
Okay.
My brother Pierre Gary, one-on-one.
Okay.
And he knew that if he didn't change, he would be disfellowshipped. He just left the church. That's what usually happens. When you confront somebody, they usually just pack up and leave,
Yeah.
That's unfortunate, but that's the way it works 99% of the time.
Yeah. That's what happens. It's hard to expel someone that's already gone. I guess you can make an announcement.
That's why we haven't had some public,
That's
thing.
right. People just,
they don't want to deal with it, so they move on.
it's rare that people want to just stay in a fellowship that's uncomfortable with what they're doing constantly. But that still doesn't say that there shouldn't be a confrontation, that the sinful nature may be destroyed and the spirit saved. And I guess in a sense, we have had some confrontations over the years on sexual immorality and marriage and divorce, and that has happened. And often the person has not accepted the counsel or the advice, and it just kind of disappeared.
And because it doesn't happen publicly doesn't mean it never happens.
That's right. That's right.
Usually, I think generally, if it comes down to something public, the thing's already decided. There's no question what's going to happen next. That's to me, the public announcement is, basically an acknowledgement, as we're saying, of what's already happening. Much more valuable, I think, and much more useful, perhaps, are the times when we go to one another and say, look, I'm seeing this. I noticed this. Is everything okay? Do you want to talk? Because this isn't acceptable. That's certainly something that has happened in my experience here. And so to me that's much more constructive, and it's much more possible that what Paul's talking about here will get done in that kind of setting. Where with concern and with love we go. And too often I think churches let things go and either pretend not to know or really don't know until something explodes, and then it's damage control. And damage control, often part of damage control is we've got to do something to distance ourselves from this, and that's what winds up happening instead of something more constructive. Anyway, that's just my thought.
No, I agree. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, some situations that have been confronted in meeting. Maybe not everybody knows about it, but
I've been in some of those meetings with you. Not with you, not confronting you, but we've been in some of those meetings
with others. So
we know that happens.
But that was a problem in this church that Paul wanted them to deal with, and rather than him having to deal with when he came. And I wouldn't want to be in a meeting like that with the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, he would have confronted him.
Yeah.
One-on-one.
Yeah. And I'm sure that he had situations like that in his career. So, but that's, again, it's easier not to confront. And we need to keep that in mind as we live from day to day and work and deal with people. It's easy just to hope for the best and go on. Well, maybe they'll come around, but anyway.
Well, she has a key.
Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, that you may be a new batch without yeast, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. Kind of a, what's his point there?
Well, I think in the beginning there, he's talking, they have this man in their congregation, and they're tolerating his behavior. And I think what Paul is saying, that this is not a good situation, not only for him, but for the church itself, because you have this this sin happening, and it's like he's saying that the yeast eventually grows and it goes into the whole batch of dough, and that man's immorality could come to infect
Yeah.
other people in the church and spoil them as well. So he's saying, you got to get rid of this and bring in the new.
Then he brings up, for Christ, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Why does he bring that in right at this time?
Well, don't they in relation to yeast at the Passover, Jewish people do a deep cleaning of their home in order to get rid of any yeast that
Or
might
leaven,
be
yeah.
there.
Yeah, that's the Jewish tradition. You sweep the house.
Right.
You don't want even a speck of leaven, or as you say, yeast in the house.
They even have two kitchens that they use. The one kitchen is reserved exclusively for use at the Passover, so that again, there's nothing that has ever even been used with yeast.
Contamination. Yeah, I had customers in Skokie that had two kitchens in their home. One in the basement for Easter and one upstairs for everyday cooking.
Not for Easter,
Well,
but Passover.
Well, Passover. It's not the same thing. But,
Well, that's not the same thing, but
yeah, I know. But anyway, it just showed they went to a great extremes to have that second kitchen put in. And we're talking thousands of dollars to have it installed. And I think it even had a plastic, like a bubble wrap around it or something, to keep it perfectly pure. Yeah. I saw one, a couple of them.
Yeah, they're very careful.
Very, I should say, purified.
Get rid of the old yeast, and the Jewish of sweeping the house is kind of an illustration. Be very careful that there's none of the old influence left. How do you do that? We don't sweep our houses. Maybe we do need to sweep our houses of some things.
We use vacuum cleaners today. Yeah.
We have vacuum cleaners. That's right. But how do you keep that yeast out of your house, or that leaven, or that influence?
Well, I think Paul's point here, you mentioned Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. He's saying we've gone through the Passover, so to speak. We've gone through the cleansing process. The yeast has been removed, and we don't want it coming back in. So that's why you gotta stop this. That's why we've got to address this and can't just let it go, because if you let the yeast go, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to continue to leaven, and more is going to be affected. So it's about this new reality, this new thing that we recognize. And so a lot of it has to do with we live up to what's been done in Christ, that we're unleavened now, so to speak, to use the metaphor. And we, it requires us to be careful about not letting those influences in, that not letting things like that go as a community.
Yeah, Alan, I think we have to treat sin like a bad odor in the house, similar to a skunk odor. Okay, if we have any trace of that coming around, we do everything in our power to get rid of it. Right?
Yeah.
Get it out of our house, just get rid of it. And that's how we have to kind of treat sin, is like a bad odor. It's something that we have a strong desire to not be around, and that's how we go through our lives. Because of what Christ did on the cross to get rid of our sin, that should be kind of our reaction, I think.
I thought I read the verse, therefore let us keep the festival. And I guess that's the reference to the Passover. But in a sense, we have the festival or the feast every week with the Lord's Supper. And one of the things we do in connection with the Lord's Supper that we're instructed to do is examine ourselves. And so that's part of the sweeping the house of the East. If we examine our lives and we say, am I allowing materialism to come into my life? Am I allowing bitterness and, towards some other people to come into my life? Am I allowing pride? We need to keep a list of the potential yeasts. He mentions here malice and wickedness, but he's going to mention more in the next paragraph. We need to keep maybe a list of those things and check them off, if you will, as we think about the Lord's Supper. Maybe there's areas that we need to keep out of our lives. We want the bread of sincerity and truth. I've written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. So here's a slightly, a different aspect of this topic. Do we have that letter? It's not listed as, pre-1 Corinthians in my Bible. Some people argue that it's somewhere within these works. But anyway, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. And some Christians have sought to do that over the centuries, haven't they, to be isolated from the world. But I think Paul would say we're not to be isolated, we're to be the yeast of sincerity and truth. And you can't be yeast unless you're a part of the dough, if you will. But now I'm writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother. So God will, he'll go on, God will take care of the people who are not part of the church, but as Christians, we're responsible for the church. I'm writing, you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral or greedy, and we tend to, sexual immorality, that's bad. Greed, it's not so bad.
In America, we think
Did you ever,
good,
we've counseled some people about sexual immorality. Maybe you're getting into a relationship but I don't ever remember counseling somebody about greed. It's hard. An idolater, greed is in a sense idolatry. A slanderer, somebody who's speaking about others behind their back, perhaps. A drunkard or a swindler. With such a man, do not even eat. Don't eat with a greedy man. Boy, anyway, those are the yeast.
If you eat with a greedy guy. So.
I'm sorry?
If you eat with somebody who's greedy, he won't pay the bill for you. So
that's right. There you go. Somebody who won't pick up the tab. Anyway, but what Paul is saying is we tend to identify some sins as real bad, but others is, not so bad. We need to be careful because they're all that type of yeast that can infest and infect the body. And what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked man from among you. So that's the problem in the church. Any other comments on that chapter?
I'm just reminded that, there are church, and you know, you see it in the news so much now. You see it, you see these stories about high profile churches and high profile church leaders and these scandals attached, and sometimes they're monetary, sometimes they're sexual, but you know, there's these, you know, sometimes it's power and the way power is used, the way people are treated. And it's just a reminder to me about how even churches that are, you know, pretty strict and pretty, you know, we would say, man, they're pretty conservative and they're pretty biblical, and they're, you know, and even there, things, sometimes they let things go on. And you'll hear, you know, as these things come out, you hear, well, he was like this all the time, you know, he's been like this for years, or he's done these things for years, or, you know, this financial impropriety was going on for years, and nobody, you know, nobody said anything, or nobody did anything about it. And people knew, and, you know, and they were, you know, discredited or pushed out, or, and you know, it just reminds you how insidious it can be, that you know, we kind of convince ourselves, right, that well, we're doing the Lord's work, and so as long as we're doing the Lord's work, well, you know, we can let some things slide. Maybe we can, you know, something part of it, and you know, it blows up every time, and you just see it. You know, the scandal in the Catholic Church that isn't just a Catholic scandal, even.
That's right.
This stuff has just gone on for so long and is not addressed, and you know, and
So what Paul's saying is evil, though, is not to be tolerated in the church. I mean,
what's that?
He's saying that evil, though, is not to be tolerated in the church, and we're gonna have to make some judgments on that, I guess.
And even you know, and even churches that are very strict and very conservative and very narrow in the way they interpret Scripture, it happens in them too. And sometimes, especially, it seems it's happening in them. And I just think we have to be, you know, be hyper aware of that sometimes.
Yeah.
Can I ask the question?
Sure.
Is it a sin for us to criticize those institutions that have a lot of different problems and sexual stuff going on?
Well, no, I think what Paul is saying is we need to confront, and we need to deal with the situation in showing that we love the person and that we're concerned about their spiritual welfare. And I think there's a way to approach it in that way. That you say, we're concerned that this activity, this relationship, this emphasis in your life is not going to lead you to heaven. What do you think? I think we have to do that if we're loving Christians. You know, he's later we read, you know, he that can converts a sinner from the error of his ways is doing a good thing, because it leads to heaven. It's hard.
What I was speaking about, I think I criticized, and I feel as though if the Bible tells us not to gossip or condemn a person, you know, for things that they're doing.
Yeah.
But I find myself, I do that. And what it does, it makes me, the afterthought makes me feel as though I'm sinning by talking about those things.
Well, you know how we often criticize, we don't go to the person, we go to somebody else and say, oh, such and such is doing such and such, and that's wrong. But we're unwilling to go and talk to that person about the situation. We're willing to talk to everybody else in the church, but we won't go to the person and raise it. You know how, and then, you know, I've had, you know, you hear somebody talking about somebody else, you got to wonder, that person, what are they saying about me when I'm not around? So, you know, we just kind of have to say, I don't want to hear that. Go to the person And we have to be
Sometimes-
careful that we don't do that.
Sometimes it falls to the elders to confront a person, you know.
Yeah,
These are all sensitive issues, sensitive situations.
yeah,
And sometimes an elder is in a better position, you know, to confront a person or maybe a group of them, you know.
yeah.
They would do it in a loving way, of course, you know,
Or
and maybe
if
they
you're
have more
talking about,
experience.
are you talking about like particular groups, Linda, particular,
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Oh, boy.
to me, I mean, one of the things I think we do sometimes is we go, oh, that group of people over there, they've done these terrible things, and it's easy to, to sort of feel better about ourselves by being critical of them. And I don't think that's very constructive.
Yeah,
But I do think there are times when it takes somebody from outside to say, I mean, that's how a lot of these scandals finally get exposed, right? That somebody from outside says, they hear from a victim, for instance, and they say, somebody has to do something about this. Somebody has to take this person's side, and so I think sometimes that is necessary, but I do think there are times, I mean, for myself, where I probably have, been critical of other groups and taken some delight in that, because that's not me, that's not our tribe, that we're talking about. So I don't know if that helps for what that's worth. But
Well, I just know for a fact that it's true.
yeah, we're on dangers when we criticize a group, because people within any group have different beliefs.
But it's good that you realize that, Linda.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
think so.
I was going to talk about something that's of interest to me, namely lawsuits, but I guess we'll leave that till next time, and we'll bring it up at that time.
Okay, so we'll start at 1 Corinthians chapter 6.
Chapter 6, verse 1 next time for sure. Thank you, Linda, for always keeping up. I guess we'll go to our hymn now, and we'll close with that. Thanks for your thoughts.
Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, this is my constant longing and prayer. Let me have forfeit all earth's pleasures, Jesus, thy perfect likeness to wear. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, blessed God, come in my sweetness, come in my fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, full of compassion, loving, forgiving, tender and kind, helping the helpless, cheering the fainting, seeking the wandering sinner to find. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, lowly in spirit, holy and harmless, patient and brave, enduring cruel reproaches, willing to suffer others to save. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, known as the Word. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, Lord, I am coming, now to receive the anointing divine. All that I am and that I am bringing, Lord, from this moment, all shall be thine. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, glorious thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, and thine own image deep on my heart.
Thank you.
Everybody have a good week.
God bless.
You too.
Guys have a nice
Bye,
week.
On my-
Nope.
Bye, bye, darling. Bye,
Everybody.
Linda.
bye, everyone. Till Sunday. Wait, till Wednesday.
See you Wednesday.
Wednesday.
See you, Linda.
Okay, Patrick, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Have a good week.
okay, too.
Talk to you. Bye.
Hello?
Sorry, what? I missed that.
Hello?
I missed that. You're breaking up there. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You keep breaking up. You keep breaking up. I can't hear. You're echoing, breaking up.